We often wonder what makes a person truly great in the eyes of God. This story is not about a perfect man. It is about a flawed man, a warrior, a king, and a sinner. His life was filled with triumph, but also with deep personal and devastating failures. This is the story of David, and the reason he is remembered is not because he never fell. It is because every time he fell, his heart, when it broke in the direction of his God. This is the ultimate story of repentance. To understand this complex journey of faith and human failing, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more. The land of Israel held its breath. It was a nation living in the long, cold shadow of its king. The air in the towns and villages felt thin, stretched taut with a fear that had little to do with the Philistine armies camped on the borders. The true dread emanated from the king's court at Gibeah. King Saul, the man who had once stood taller than any other, was now a hollow giant, haunted by the echoes of his own choices. A spiritual darkness, heavier and more oppressive than any winter fog, had settled upon the throne. Saul was a king at war, not only with his enemies but with his own mind. He was stalked by paranoia, seeing betrayal in the eyes of his most loyal servants, and hearing threats in the rustle of the wind. The Spirit of the Lord, which had once rushed upon him and given him the strength of a hero, had departed. In its place, a troubling presence descended, a disquiet that no mortal power could soothe. His rages were sudden and terrifying, his silences long and full of despair. The kingdom was adrift because its king was lost. In this atmosphere of decay, the prophet Samuel grieved. He was an old man now, his shoulders stooped not just with age, but with the weight of a nation's failing. He had been the one to anoint Saul, to present him to the people as their chosen ruler. He had watched Saul's rise with a father's hope, and had witnessed his fall with a father's sorrow. He mourned for the king that was, and for the kingdom that was suffering. It was into this grief that a new command came, a voice that was as clear as it was terrifying. The Lord spoke to Samuel, jolting him from his mourning. "How long will you grieve for Saul, seeing I have rejected him from reigning over Israel?" The words were final. A door closed on an entire era. "Fill your horn with oil and go. I will send you to Bethlehem, to a man named Jesse, for I have provided for myself a king among his sons." Fear, cold and sharp, pierced Samuel's heart. This was not a simple task. It was an act of profound danger. To anoint a new king, while the old one still lived, was treason. Saul, in his paranoia, would not hesitate to strike down a prophet if he suspected such a thing. "How can I go?" Samuel replied, his voice barely a whisper. "If Saul hears it, he will seek to end my life." The Lord provided an answer, a way to cloak the mission in secrecy. "Take a heifer with you, and say you have come to make a sacrifice to the Lord, and call Jesse to the sacrifice. I will show you what you shall do. You shall anoint for me the one I name to you." And so Samuel went. He left Ramah with the heifer, his steps heavy with the gravity of his secret. Every traveler on the road seemed a potential spy, every distant shout a royal patrol. He was a kingmaker moving in the shadows, carrying a flask of oil that held the future of the nation, and a secret that could mean his own end. When he arrived at the gates of Bethlehem, the elders of the town came out to meet him, their faces pale. They trembled as they approached the aged prophet. "Do you come peacefully?" they asked. Samuel looked at them, his gaze steady, offering the public story that concealed the true one. "Peacefully," he said. "I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Consecrate yourselves, and come with me to the sacrifice." And he consecrated Jesse and his sons, and called them to the sacred meal, his eyes searching, wondering which of these men was about to change the world. The house of Jesse was filled with an anxious energy, the presence of the great prophet Samuel, the most powerful spiritual figure in Israel, had set the small town of Bethlehem on edge. Jesse, a man of standing, presented his sons with a nervous pride. This was an unexpected honor. The first to step forward was Eliab, the eldest. He was a man made in the mold of a king, tall and with a commanding presence. His shoulders were broad, and his features were strong. When Samuel saw him, the prophet's breath caught. Surely this was the one. He was the very image of what a leader should be, the kind of man armies would follow. Samuel thought, "Surely the Lord's anointed is before him." But the inner voice, the one that had guided him his entire life, spoke clearly and firmly within his mind. Do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have refused him. The Lord does not see as man sees. For man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. Samuel, obédient, let Eliab passe. One by one, Jesse's sons were brought before him. Abinadab was next, strong and capable. He too was passed over. Then Shammah, and so it went, through 7 of Jesse's sons. Each was presented, each was inspected, and each was met with the same divine silence. Samuel stood in growing confusion. The oil remained in the horn. The prophet turned to Jesse, his brow furrowed. Are all your young men here? Jesse paused, as if forgetting. There remains yet the youngest, he said, almost as an afterthought. But behold, he is keeping the sheep. The prophet's command was immediate. Send and bring him, for we will not sit down until he comes here. The summons traveled from the tense atmosphere of the house out into the open fields and rolling hills. It traveled to a world that knew nothing of sacrifices or secret anointings. Out there was only the wind, the sharp scent of time, and the bleating of the flock. This was the world of David, the 8th son, the one not considered important enough to be called to the prophet's feast. His life was one of solitude and vigilance. He spent his days guiding the sheep to green pastures and still waters, his ears always alert to the distant cry of a hyena or the shadow of a circling eagle. He knew the weight of a lion's roar and the swift, silent threat of a bear. In those long hours he had learned courage, not in the clamor of a battlefield, but in the quiet defense of his father's flock. His only companions were his harp and his God. He sang songs to the sky, his music a pure and honest conversation with the Creator he felt in the stones and the stars. A messenger ran to him, shouting his name. He was summoned, confused, leaving his sheep with a helper. David, the shepherd boy, went. He entered the house, his face ruddy from the wind, his eyes bright and full of life. He was young, handsome, but he still carried the scent of the fields. He was a stark contrast to his polished, armored, and anxious older brothers. He stood before the prophet, breathing heavily from his run, unaware that he was the reason for this entire assembly. As Samuel looked at the boy, the voice of the Lord resonated within him, final and full of authority. Arise, anoint him, for this is the one. Samuel lifted the horn of oil. The room fell into a profound silence. The brothers watched, their faces a mixture of confusion and disbelief. This was the youngest, the boy, the one they sent to do the menial tasks. Jesse stood frozen. Samuel moved toward David, who looked up at the old prophet with wide, questioning eyes. The prophet poured the oil over David's head. It ran down his hair, over his forehead, and onto his shepherd's tunic. It was not a magical, fiery moment. It was a quiet, sacred act. But as the oil touched him, David felt something shift, not just on him, but in him. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him from that day forward, a warm, steady, and invisible weight. It was a sense of purpose, a silent hum of destiny that he could not yet understand. And then it was over. The prophet Samuel rose, his mission complete. The sacrifice was finished. The guests departed. Samuel began his long, secret journey back to Ramah, and David, the newly anointed king of Israel, the man carrying the heaviest secret in the kingdom, was sent back to the fields. He returned to his father's sheep, the scent of sacred oil mixing with the dust of the hills. The sky was the same, the sheep were the same, and the dangers in the shadows were the same. But everything had changed. While David carried his secret in the quiet fields of Bethlehem, the royal court at Gibeah was suffocating. The darkness that had begun to settle on King Saul was no longer a passing mood. It was a living shadow in the throne room. The king, who had been chosen for his height and his strength, was now diminished by a disquiet that came from deep within. He was volatile, his silences as frightening as his sudden bursts of rage. His servants and soldiers moved around him with quiet, fearful steps, never knowing what might trigger the king's despair or his suspicion. The Spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul, and in that vacuum, a tormenting presence had found its home. His attendants, desperate to bring their master some relief, whispered among themselves. Finally, one of them dared to make a suggestion. "Behold now, a distressing spirit is troubling you," the servant said carefully. Let our Lord now command your servants, who are before you, to seek out a man who is a skillful player on the harp. And it shall be that when the distressing spirit is upon you, that he shall play with his hand, and you shall be well." Saul, in a moment of clarity, agreed, "Provide me now a man who can play well, and bring him to me." It was then that another servant, perhaps one who had traveled through Bethlehem, spoke up. "Look, I have seen a son of Jesse the Bethlehemite," he said. "He is skillful in playing, a mighty man of valor, a man of war, prudent in speech, and a handsome person. And the most important thing, the Lord is with him." The connection was made. A summons was sent. David the shepherd was called from his flocks once more. He came to the court not as a king in waiting, but as a musician, a healer. He brought with him a simple gift of bread, a skin of wine, and a young goat. He was brought before Saul, a king plagued by shadows, and he stood there, a young man who carried the secret light of an anointing. When Saul saw him, he found a moment of peace. David was given a place in the court, and so a strange new life began. Whenever the darkness would descend upon Saul, when the paranoia and the dread would begin to twist the king's features, David would be called. He would take his harp and his hands would move across the strings. The music he played was not the music of palaces or of armies. It was the music of the open fields, of quiet nights spent under the stars, of a deep and uncomplicated faith. The notes were like clear, cool water in a parched land. They filled the oppressive silence of the court, and for a time they would push the shadows back. The music would refresh Saul. The distressing spirit would depart from him, and he would be well. David the musician soothed the very man whose throne he was destined to take. But this peace was fragile. The king was a broken man. He began to look at David with a complicated gaze. He saw the young man who brought him peace, but he also saw the young man who was capable, strong, and loved by others. One day, as David was playing, the darkness rushed back upon Saul with a terrifying force. The king sat in his place, his eyes fixed on the young musician, but he was not seeing a healer. He was seeing a rival. In Saul's hand was the spear he always kept near. In a sudden, violent motion, the king's suspicion overwhelmed him. He said in his heart, "I will pin David to the wall." He hurled the spear with all his strength. David, ever watchful, moved at the last possible moment. The sound of the heavy spear striking the wooden wall, vibrating just where David had been standing, echoed through the chamber. The music stopped. David did not wait. He fled from the king's presence, his harp left behind. He had escaped, unharmed, but he now understood the truth. The court was not a sanctuary. It was a place of deep and unpredictable danger. The season turned, and Israel went to war. The Philistine armies had gathered their strength, marching into the territory of Judah and setting up their camp. King Saul, his own spirit fractured, gathered the men of Israel, and they camped in the valley of Elah, facing their enemies across the wide, empty ravine. For 40 days the two armies remained in a stalemate, a paralysis of fear. The source of this fear was not the army itself, but its champion. Every morning and every evening a man would stride out from the Philistine camp, his voice echoing from the hillsides. He was a giant, a man named Goliath from the city of Gath. His height was enormous, a terrifying spectacle for the soldiers who watched from their tents. He was a fortress of bronze and iron. He wore a helmet of bronze, and he was armed with a coat of mail that weighed as much as a man. He had bronze armor on his legs and a javelin of bronze between his shoulders. The staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and its iron head was a thing of terror. A soldier walked before him, carrying his massive shield. He would stand and shout to the armies of Israel, his voice thick with scorn, "Why have you come out to line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and prevail, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." He would pause, his voice dripping with contempt. "I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." When Saul and all of Israel heard these words, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. The king's champion was gone. The Spirit of the Lord was gone. There was no one who dared to answer the challenge. The entire nation was held hostage by one man's voice. Into this valley of fear David arrived. He was not there as a soldier. He had been sent by his father Jesse to check on his 3 eldest brothers who were in the army. He was a delivery boy, carrying an ephah of dried grain, 10 loaves of bread for his brothers, and 10 cheeses for their captain. He ran to the camp and found his brothers just as the army was going out to the battle line, shouting the war cry. As he was talking with them, the champion, Goliath, came forward from the Philistine ranks and spoke the same words of defiance, and David heard them. All the men of Israel, when they saw the giant, fled from him in terror. But David did not feel fear. He felt a hot, burning indignation. This was not a soldier insulting other soldiers. This was a man defying his God. "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine?" David asked the men standing near him, that he should defy the armies of the living God. His eldest brother Eliab heard him speaking. His face flushed with anger. He looked at his youngest brother with contempt. "Why did you come down here? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and the insolence of your heart. You have come down to see the battle." David did not back down. "What have I done now?" he asked. Was it not just a question? He turned away from his brother and continued to ask the other soldiers about the giant. His words, so full of courage, were a strange sound in that terrified camp. They were so strange that they were repeated, passed from soldier to soldier, until finally they reached the ears of the king. David was summoned to Saul's tent. David stood before King Saul, the same king who had recently tried to end his life with a spear. But the darkness had lifted from Saul for a moment, replaced by the deep, weary fear of the giant. "You are not able to go against this Philistine," Saul said, looking at the young man. "You are a youth, and he is a man of war from his youth." But David's courage was not born of arrogance, it was born of experience. "Your servant used to keep his father's sheep," David said, his voice clear and steady. "And when a lion or a bear came and took a lamb out of the flock, I went out after it and struck it, and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And when it arose against me, I caught it by its beard, and struck it and prevailed." He continued, "The Lord, who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." Saul, perhaps hearing a faint echo of the faith he himself had lost, relented. "Go," he said, "and the Lord be with you." Then, trying to help in the only way he knew, Saul clothed David with his own armor. He put a bronze helmet on his head and dressed him in a coat of mail. David fastened his sword to his armor and tried to walk, but he could not. He was weighed down by the heavy, unfamiliar armor of a king. "I cannot go with these," David said, "for I have not tested them." So he took them off. He returned to being a shepherd. He took his staff in his hand, the one he had used for years in the fields. He walked to the nearby brook and stooped down. He searched the shallow water and selected 5 smooth stones, placing them carefully into his shepherd's bag. With his sling in his hand, he walked out of the camp and down into the valley toward the waiting giant. Goliath saw him coming, and his face contorted in disbelief, then in rage. He looked at the young shepherd with his simple staff and his bag, and he laughed, a deep, rumbling sound of mockery. "Am I a dog," the giant bellowed, "that you come to me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. "Come to me," Goliath roared, "and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." David did not stop walking. His voice, clear and strong, rang out across the silence of the valley. "You come to me with a sword, and with a spear, and with a shield," David shouted, "but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand. That all this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands." As the giant moved, David ran forward to meet him. He reached into his bag, took out a stone, and placed it in his sling. He began to spin the sling faster and faster, a blur of motion. He released the stone. It flew, straight and true, a small dark point against the sky. It whistled through the air and met its mark, the one small place unprotected by bronze. The giant's words stopped. His massive body froze, his arms hung limp. He swayed for a long, silent moment, his great shield clattering on the stones. He stumbled, and then he fell, crashing face down onto the earth. A deep, profound silence fell over the valley. The champion of Gath did not move. He was defeated, The Philistine army watched, frozen in shock. Their impossible champion was gone. Their terror turned to panic. They broke, turned, and ran. From the other side of the valley, the Israelite army, which had been paralyzed for 40 days, let out a single, unified, deafening roar. They surged down the hillside, charging after their fleeing enemies. The victory was total. The shepherd, with his faith and a single stone, had saved the nation. In the golden aftermath of the victory, David was brought before King Saul. He stood in the king's tent, the dust of the valley still on him, a young man who had just redrawn the map of the war. Saul looked at him, his gaze intense, trying to understand the shepherd who had done what his entire army could not. "Whose son are you, young man?" Saul asked. Standing beside the king was his son Jonathan, the heir to the throne. Jonathan was a warrior in his own right, a man of great courage and deep faith. He had watched David walk into the valley. He had heard his words of defiance. He had seen the impossible fall. And as he looked at David now, he did not feel the stirrings of jealousy or political calculation. He felt a powerful, immediate, and profound recognition, as if a part of his own spirit, long searching, had just found its counterpart. He watched as David answered the king, his voice clear and without arrogance. And in that moment, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David. He loved him as he loved his own soul. It was a bond that transcended rank, politics, and the shadow of the crown that hung over them both. While Saul was calculating David's usefulness, Jonathan saw his equal. While Saul was making David a captain in his army, Jonathan was making him a brother in his heart. When the king had finished speaking, Jonathan acted, sealing this new bond in the only way a prince knew how. He stepped forward. In a gesture that stunned the other commanders, Jonathan began to remove his own princely robe, the very garment that marked him as the heir to the throne of Israel. He held it out and gave it to David, the shepherd. It was an act of profound, symbolic humility. It was a silent declaration that he, the prince, recognized the anointing on this young man. But he did not stop there. He then unfastened his own armor, the armor of a prince, and gave that to David as well. He gave him his tunic. He unbuckled his sword, the sword of the air, and gave it to David. He even gave him his bow. In this one quiet act, Jonathan had essentially disarmed himself, stripping away his own identity and offering it to his new friend. He was placing his loyalty to David above his loyalty to his own future. It was a covenant of friendship, pure and unconditional, a light that had just been lit in a court that was beginning to grow very dark. David's star ascended with astonishing speed. King Saul placed him over the men of war, and this new captain was accepted in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's own servants. Whatever mission the king sent him on, David behaved himself wisely. He acted with prudence, and he met with success. He was no longer just the musician who soothed the king, nor the boy who had faced a giant. He was a leader, a man of wisdom and valor, and the heart of the nation began to turn toward him. The armies returned from another engagement with the Philistines. As they marched toward the city, the women came out from all the towns of Israel to meet King Saul, singing and dancing with tambourines and with instruments of music. They were joyful, celebrating the victory and the peace their soldiers had won, and as they danced, they sang a new song, a refrain that passed from village to village, a song of popular praise. They sang, "Saul has struck down his thousands." This part of the song pleased the king. He smiled, accepting their adoration. But then the song continued, and the women sang the second part with even more enthusiasm. And David his tens of thousands. The music did not stop, but for King Saul, the celebration ended in that instant. The sound of the tambourines became a dreadful noise. The song became a taunt. His eyes darkened, and he looked at David, who was receiving the cheers of the people. The seed of jealousy, which had been planted when the spear first hit the wall, now grew into a monstrous root of paranoia. "They have ascribed to David tens of thousands," Saul muttered to himself, his voice thick with anger. "And to me they have ascribed only thousands. What more can he have but the kingdom?" From that day forward, Saul eyed David. The shepherd was no longer a comfort. He was a threat. The darkness returned to Saul, heavier and more violent than before. The next day, David came into the king's presence as he had done before. He took up his harp to play, hoping the music might bring the king peace. But Saul was beyond peace. He sat in his chair, a shadow over his face, his hand gripping the spear that he now kept with him at all times. He was not listening to the music. He was listening to the echo of that song about tens of thousands. His rage overcame him. He saw his rival, the man the people loved more, sitting before him. In his heart, Saul said, "I will pin David to the wall." He did not hesitate. With a sudden, violent motion, he hurled the spear directly at David. David, ever watchful, sensed the movement. He slipped aside, and the heavy spear flew past him. It struck the wall with a terrible sound, the wooden shaft vibrating with the force of the king's hatred. David did not say a word. He did not look back. He fled from the king's presence, the notes of his harp left hanging unfinished in the terrifying silence. Saul's intentions were no longer secret. The king was now actively trying to end his life. Saul was now trapped. His attempts to harm David directly had failed, and his open jealousy was becoming obvious. He could not simply strike David down because the people loved him. The young man was a national hero, and Saul's own son, Jonathan, clearly favored him. So the king devised a new plan, one that was more subtle and far more treacherous. He would not use his own hand. He would use the hands of the Philistines. Saul had another daughter, Michal, and Saul saw that she, like so many in Israel, looked upon David with affection. The king saw this not as a father but as a strategist. He saw her love as a snare he could set. He approached David and offered his daughter in marriage. David, who was still just a shepherd from a humble family, was taken aback. "Who am I," David said, "and what is my life or my father's family in Israel, that I should be son-in-law to the king?" He was wary. The king who had thrown a spear at him was now offering him a great honor. Saul pressed the offer, pretending to be generous. "The king desires no dowry," his servants told David. "He does not want gold or silver or flocks." This was meant to put David at ease, to make him believe the offer was one of true friendship. But then came the price. The king desires only 100 proofs of victory from the Philistines. It was an impossible and brutal request. It was not a dowry, it was a death sentence. To acquire such a thing would mean walking into the heart of enemy territory, into their strongest garrisons, and provoking a fight that no man was expected to survive. Saul thought, let the hand of the Philistines be against him. He was certain David would fall in the attempt, and his problem would be solved. David, however, did not see the trap. He saw only the dangerous task and the honor of marrying the king's daughter. It pleased him to become the king's son-in-law. He gathered his men, and he went. He did not just seek to meet the king's requirement, he sought to exceed it. He and his men went into Philistine lands, and they fought with the courage and wisdom that had made David famous. Before the allotted time had expired, David returned to the court. He came before King Saul, not wounded, not defeated, but victorious. And he presented the king not with 100, but with 200 proofs of his valor. Saul was stunned. His plan had failed in every way. He had not only failed to get rid of David, but he had given his rival an even greater victory, and now he was trapped by his own words. He had no choice. He gave Michal, his daughter, to David as his wife. David was now bound even more tightly to the royal family. And Saul, seeing that the Lord was with David and that his own daughter loved him, was even more afraid. His hatred for David became a permanent, settled thing in his heart. The king's rage was no longer a secret. It was an open declaration of war against his own son-in-law. Saul spoke to his son Jonathan and to all his servants and gave them a direct command. They were to find David and end his life. The hunt had begun in earnest. But Saul had miscalculated Jonathan's loyalty. Jonathan's bond with David was stronger than his fear of his father. He went to David in secret, his heart heavy. "My father Saul is seeking to harm you," he warned. "Therefore, please, be on your guard in the morning. Stay in a secret place and hide yourself." Jonathan tried one last time to reason with his father, reminding him of David's loyalty, of his victory over the giant, of how he had only ever served the king well. Saul, in a moment of clarity, was convinced and made an oath. "As the Lord lives, he shall not be harmed." But the peace was false. The moment the distressing spirit returned, so did the rage. Saul again hurled his spear at David, and again David was forced to flee. It was the final, broken straw. Jonathan knew he had to give his friend a sign that could not be mistaken, a sign that meant their time together was over. He arranged to meet David in a field, by a stone. "I will shoot 3 arrows to the side of it," Jonathan planned. He would bring a young boy to retrieve the arrows. If Jonathan said to the boy, "Look, the arrows are on this side of you," it meant David was safe. But if he shouted, "Look, the arrows are beyond you," it was the signal. It meant David must run for his life. The next day, David hid in the field, his heart breaking. He watched as Jonathan shot the 3 arrows. The boy ran. "Is not the arrow beyond you?" Jonathan cried out, his voice carrying the terrible message. The boy gathered the arrows and returned to the city. David was now alone. He was an outlaw. He ran to his own house, but Saul's messengers were already there, watching the doors, waiting for morning to come so they could take him. That night, Michal, his wife, came to him. Her loyalty was to her husband, not her father. "If you do not save your life tonight," she whispered, "tomorrow you will be taken." There was no time. The house was surrounded. Michal led David to a window. She held the rope as he lowered himself down into the darkness. He fled, disappearing into the night. Michal, hearing the guards at the door, moved quickly. She took a household image, an idol, and laid it in David's bed. She put a pillow of goat's hair at its head and covered the entire thing with a cloth, making it look like a sleeping form. When Saul's messengers finally burst in to seize David, Michal pointed to the bed. "He is sick," she said. The messengers returned to Saul, who was enraged. "Bring him to me in the bed, that I may end his life," the king commanded. They went back, but this time they tore the covers off, and the deception was revealed. The ruse had bought David precious time. He was already far away, a fugitive running for his life in the very kingdom he had been anointed to one day rule. David was now truly alone. The adrenaline of the escape had faded, replaced by the cold, gnawing realities of a fugitive's life. He was the most famous man in Israel, yet he had nowhere to lay his head. He was the king's son-in-law, yet the king himself sought his life. He was hungry, he was unarmed, and he was desperate. His first stop was the city of Nob, where the tabernacle stood. He went to Ahimelech the priest. When Ahimelech saw David, the anointed hero of Israel, arriving alone and looking hunted, he came out trembling to meet him. "Why are you alone?" the priest asked, "and no one is with you?" David, cornered by his fear, made a fateful decision. He lied. "The king has commanded me on a secret matter," David said, his voice low and urgent. He said to me, "Let no one know anything about the business on which I send you. I have directed my young men to a certain place." It was a lie born of desperation, a story to calm the priest's fears. But it was a lie that would have a terrible cost. "Now then," David continued, "what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread, or whatever can be found." Ahimelech was troubled. "There is no common bread here," the priest replied. "There is only the holy bread, the bread of the presence, which has been taken from before the Lord. It is only for those who have kept themselves clean." "Truly," David assured him, "my men are clean." The priest, trusting the word of the great hero, gave him the consecrated bread. David then pressed his luck. "Do you not have a spear or a sword here?" "I was not able to bring my own weapon, because the king's business required haste." Ahimelech pointed. "The sword of Goliath the Philistine, whom you yourself defeated in the valley of Elah, is here. It is wrapped in a cloth. If you will take that, take it, for there is no other here." The irony was profound. The trophy of his greatest victory, the very weapon he had claimed, was now his only means of defense. "There is none like it," David said, his voice grim. "Give it to me." He took the bread and the sword, but he did not leave unseen. In the shadows of the tabernacle, another man was present, detained there before the Lord. His name was Doeg, an Edomite, the chief of Saul's herdsmen. He watched the entire exchange. He saw the priest help David. He saw David take the bread, and he saw him take the giant's sword. Doeg remained silent, but he remembered everything. From Nob, David fled, knowing he could not stay in Israel. In his desperation, he made a seemingly impossible choice. He went to the heart of the enemy, to Gath, the very hometown of the giant Goliath. It was a measure of how lost he was, that he believed he could find refuge among his sworn enemies. but his fame had preceded him. The servants of King Achish of Gath recognized him almost immediately. They went to their king, their voices full of suspicion. "Is this not David, the king of the land?" They whispered. "Is this not the one of whom they sing in their dances? Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his tens of thousands." David heard them. The words of the song, which had once been his glory, were now his death warrant. He was trapped in the lion's den. Fear, cold and absolute, seized him. He realized that the hero of Israel could not survive here, but perhaps a madman could. His mind worked quickly. He had to become the opposite of the hero they feared. He began to change his behavior. He let his reason abandon him, feigning insanity in their hands. He scratched and scribbled on the wooden gates of the city, like a man without his mind. He let spittle run down from his lips and into his beard. He became a drooling, incoherent fool. When King Achish saw this display, his fear turned to disgust. "Look at this man," the king shouted at his servants. "He is insane. Why have you brought him to me? Do I lack madmen, that you have brought this fellow to play the madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come into my house?" David, the great warrior, the sweet psalmist, the king in waiting, was thrown out of the city like refuse. He had survived, but at the cost of his dignity. The hero of Israel, who had defeated a giant, was now reduced to playing the part of a village fool. David fled from Gath, carrying his humiliation and the giant's sword. He escaped to the wilderness of his own land and found refuge in the cave of Adullam. This was his lowest point. He was no longer a prince in the court, nor a hero on the battlefield. He was an outcast, hiding from the sun, his home a dark, cold, and silent cave. The darkness of the cave was a reflection of his own future. It felt like a tomb, a place where all the promises made over him had come to die. But he was not alone for long. News of his location, whispered in secret, reached his family. His brothers and all of his father's household knew that Saul's rage would not be limited to David. They too were now in danger. They packed what they could and fled Bethlehem, traveling the rocky paths to the wilderness. They found David in his cave, and for the first time in this long ordeal, the fugitive had his family by his side. It was a small comfort, but it was also a new and heavy responsibility. Then, something else began to happen. Word continued to spread, not just among his family, but through the dark corners of the kingdom. The whispers reached others who were hiding, others who were suffering under Saul's fractured rule. One by one they began to arrive. The cave, which had been a symbol of his isolation, became a gathering place. But these were not soldiers or nobles. The men who came to David were the broken and the marginalized. The scriptures say that everyone who was in distress gathered to him. Everyone who was in debt, running from what they owed, came to him. Everyone who was discontented, bitter of soul against the king and the world, joined him. They were not a disciplined army. They were a desperate mob of outcasts, fishermen, farmers, and former soldiers, all running from something. They were the forgotten men of Israel. And in David, the fugitive king, they saw a fellow outcast. They saw a leader who understood their pain, their debt, and their distress. In this dark cave, surrounded by the ragged and the hopeless, David's true leadership was born. He looked at these men, and he did not see a mob. He saw a community. He was no longer just surviving. He was now responsible for them. He became their captain. There, in the darkness of Adullam, David, the shepherd, the musician, and the fugitive, began to forge a new family, a loyal band of brothers, from the 400 men who had nothing left to lose. Saul's obsession with David grew. The king, with his fractured mind, could not rest while David was alive. He heard that David and his men were in the wilderness of En-Gedi, a desolate place of high rocks and deep caves. Saul gathered 3,000 of his finest, chosen soldiers, a massive force, and set out to hunt David down. David and his men were hiding, pushed back into the deepest recesses of one of the many caves that dotted the cliffs. They were trapped, their small band no match for the thousands of soldiers combing the wilderness for them. They sat in the thick, oppressive darkness, silent, listening to the distant shouts of the patrols. Then the sounds came closer. Someone was approaching the cave. It was a single man. He stepped out of the blinding sunlight and into the cool shadows of the cave's entrance. to find a moment of private relief. The man was King Saul. He was alone, his back to the darkness, completely unaware that the very man he was hunting and all his men were just feet away, hidden in the shadows. David's men, their eyes adjusted to the gloom, watched in stunned silence. Their enemy, their persecutor, was delivered to them, vulnerable and completely defenseless. The whispers were electric. "This is it," one of his men breathed. "This is the day the Lord spoke of. He has delivered your enemy into your hand. Now, do what you think is best." The air was thick with tension. This was his chance. He could end the chase. He could end the running. He could claim the kingdom that had been promised to him. David moved, silent as a shadow. His men held their breath, expecting the sound of a struggle. David crept forward, his knife in his hand. He got close enough to feel the king's presence, but he did not strike. Instead, with a quick, quiet motion, he cut off a corner of Saul's long outer robe. He retreated back into the darkness, holding the small piece of blue cloth. And as soon as he had done it, his heart struck him with a profound and immediate guilt. He had not harmed the king, but he had dishonored him. He had violated the man who, despite everything, was still the anointed of the Lord. He turned to his men, who were looking at him in confusion, still ready to act. "The Lord forbid," David whispered fiercely, "that I should do this thing to my master, the Lord's anointed. I will not stretch out my hand against him, for he is the anointed of the Lord." He held them back, his words full of an authority they had to obey. Saul, unaware of what had just happened, finished and left the cave, stepping back out into the bright sunlight to rejoin his soldiers. David waited. Only after Saul was a safe distance from the cave did David go to the entrance. He stepped out into the light and called out, his voice echoing across the rocks. "My lord the king." Saul stopped and turned, looking back in confusion. David bowed low, his face to the ground, showing the ultimate sign of respect. Then he stood up, and he held out the piece of cloth in his hand. "My father," David cried, "see, look at the corner of your robe in my hand. For in that I cut off the corner of your robe and did not end you. Know and see that there is neither evil nor transgression in my hand. I have not sinned against you, yet you hunt my life to take it. May the Lord judge between you and me. But my hand shall not be against you. So why, then, do you listen to the words of men who say, 'David seeks your harm'?" Saul stared at the piece of his own robe in David's hand. He understood what it meant. He knew that his life had been in David's power, and David had chosen mercy. The king's great army of 3,000 had been defeated, not by a sword, but by a simple act of profound and righteous character. The long, desperate pursuit of David had fractured the kingdom, but the final, decisive blow came not from within, but from the old enemy. The Philistine armies gathered their full strength and marched against Israel. Saul, his spirit heavy and his kingdom crumbling, gathered his army for one last desperate stand on the slopes of Mount Gilboa. The battle was a disaster from the beginning. The armies of Israel, their king no longer guided by a divine presence, broke before the Philistine charge. The battle turned into a rout, a desperate flight up the mountainside. The Philistine archers found their mark, and the sons of Saul, the princes of Israel, fell. Jonathan the valiant was lost. Abinadab and Malchishua, his brothers, were also lost. Saul himself was grievously wounded by the archers. He saw the enemy chariots closing in, and he knew his kingdom and his life had come to an end. In his final moments, his only thought was to avoid the humiliation of capture. He met his end there on the mountain, and his faithful armor-bearer, seeing that the king was gone, chose to follow his master in passing. A terrible silence fell over Mount Gilboa. The crown of Israel lay in the dust. The news of this national tragedy traveled slow, carried by rumors and fleeing soldiers. 2 days later, a man arrived at David's camp in Ziklag. His clothes were torn and he had dust on his head, a sign of deep mourning. He came before David and fell to the ground. "Where have you come from?" David asked. "I have escaped from the camp of Israel," the man said, his voice trembling. "How did it go?" David asked, his heart seizing him. "Please, tell me." The man, an Amalekite, took a breath. "The people have fled from the battle," he said. "Many have fallen, and Saul and Jonathan his son are gone also." David stared at him. "How do you know that Saul and Jonathan his son are gone?" The young man then told his story. I happened by chance to be on Mount Gilboa, he said, and there was Saul, leaning on his spear, while the chariots and horsemen closed in on him. He saw me and called to me. He asked who I was. I told him I was an Amalekite. He said to me, "Please, stand over me and help me, for my anguish has come upon me, but my life is still whole in me." So I stood over him and did as he asked, because I was sure that he could not live after he had fallen. And I took the crown that was on his head and the bracelet that was on his arm, and I have brought them here to my lord. The Amalekite, holding out the royal insignia, looked at David with expectation. He had brought the news of his rival's end and the symbols of the kingdom. He expected a great reward. David's reaction was not what he expected. There was no joy, no triumph. There was only a profound, shattering grief. David took hold of his own clothes and tore them, and all the men who were with him did the same. They mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul, for Jonathan his son, and for the entire house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. Then David turned his gaze, cold and hard, upon the Amalekite. "Were you not afraid," David asked, his voice low, "to stretch out your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?" The man's blood ran cold. He had miscalculated completely. David called to one of his young men, "Go, attend to him." The soldier did as he was commanded, and the Amalekite's story came to an end. But David's grief was not finished. It poured out of him in a song, a lament for the ones he had lost. "The beauty of Israel is slain on your high places," he cried. "How the mighty have fallen! Tell it not in Gath, publish it not in the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice. Saul and Jonathan, beloved and pleasant in their lives, and in their passing they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles, they were stronger than lions. How the mighty have fallen in the midst of the battle. O Jonathan, you were slain on your high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant you have been to me. Your love to me was extraordinary, surpassing the love of women. How the mighty have fallen, and the weapons of war have perished." After the days of mourning had passed, David was a man without direction. His king was gone, his friend was gone, and his nation was in chaos. He turned to the one place he had always found guidance. He inquired of the Lord, saying, "Shall I go up to any of the cities of Judah?" And the Lord said to him, "Go up." David asked, "To which one shall I go?" And he said, "To Hebron." So David went up to Hebron, taking his 2 wives, his loyal men, and their households. It was a homecoming, a return to his own tribal lands. And the men of Judah, his own people, came to him there. They recognized him as their leader, their hero, and their last best hope. They anointed David as king over the house of Judah. But the rest of the kingdom was not united. Abner, the son of Ner, the powerful and proud commander of Saul's army, had survived the battle of Gilboa. He was not prepared to let the kingdom fall into the hands of a shepherd from Judah. He found Ishbosheth, one of Saul's remaining sons, and brought him across the Jordan to the city of Mahanaim. And there Abner made Ishbosheth king over Gilead, over the northern tribes, and over all the parts of Israel that were not Judah. The nation was now split in 2. A deep rift ran through the land. David reigned in Hebron over the south. Ishbosheth, propped up by Abner's military might, reigned in Mahanaim over the north. A long, slow, and painful war began between the house of David and the house of Saul. The narrative of this conflict was not one of great battles, but of bitter personal rivalries. The 2 generals, Joab for David and Abner for Ishbosheth, were the true powers in this struggle. They met one day at the pool of Gibeon, their forces arrayed on opposite sides of the water. Abner, in his arrogance, called out to Joab, "Let the young men now arise and compete before us." Joab, ever grim, replied, "Let them arise." So 12 young men rose for Ishbosheth, and 12 of David's servants rose. They met in the middle. The contest was so fierce and so complete that every man fell down together, and the place was named the Field of Sharp Blades. This bitter contest ignited a severe conflict that day, and Abner and the men of Israel were beaten before the servants of David. But the day was not over. Joab had 2 brothers, Abishai and Asahel. And Asahel was as swift on his feet as a wild gazelle. He set his sights on Abner and began to pursue him, refusing to turn to the right or to the left. Abner, a seasoned warrior, looked back. "Is that you, Asahel?" he called. "It is," Asahel replied, not slowing. "Turn aside," Abner warned him. "Do not follow me. Why should I strike you to the ground? How then could I look your brother Joab in the face?" But Asahel refused to turn aside. He was young and reckless, seeking glory. Abner, seeing he had no choice, struck Asahel with a defensive move, and the young man fell there, his life expiring. The pursuit was over. But Joab and Abishai, seeing their brother fallen, were filled with a grief that hardened into a cold, dark need for vengeance. This civil war, which had begun with politics, was now a blood feud. The long war continued, but the momentum had shifted. David grew stronger and stronger, his leadership clear and his purpose firm. The house of Saul, led by a weak king and a proud general, grew weaker and weaker. The final break came not on a battlefield, but from within. Abner, the true power behind Ishbosheth's throne, had a falling out with his king. In his anger, Abner decided the losing side was no longer worth his time. He sent messengers to David in secret. "Make your covenant with me," the message said, "and my hand will be with you, to bring all of Israel over to you." David agreed, but he had one condition, a matter of personal honor. "You shall not see my face," David replied, "unless you first bring Michal, Saul's daughter, when you come to see me." She was his first wife, taken from him by Saul, and he wanted her back. Abner did as he was commanded. He returned Michal to David, and then traveled to Hebron, where David received him with a feast. They made their covenant, and Abner departed in peace, promising to unite the kingdom under David. This peaceful union, however, was not what Joab desired. Joab, David's fierce general, was returning from a raid when he heard that Abner, the man responsible for his brother's passing, had been in Hebron and had been allowed to leave in peace. He was furious. He stormed into David's presence. "What have you done?" he demanded. "You know Abner. He came to deceive you, to spy on all your comings and goings." Joab, acting without the king's knowledge, sent messengers to bring Abner back. Abner, suspecting nothing, returned. Joab met him at the city gate and drew him aside, as if to speak with him privately. And there, in an act of cold and calculated vengeance, Joab struck Abner, and his life came to an end. The blood feud for his brother Asahel was finally paid. When David heard the news, he was overcome with grief and political dread. This act of violence threatened to destroy the fragile peace he had just built. He went before all the people and publicly mourned. "I and my kingdom are guiltless before the Lord, forever of the blood of Abner," he cried out. He forced Joab himself to tear his clothes and participate in the mourning. David's genuine sorrow proved his innocence to the people. The news of Abner's end reached Ishbosheth, and all his courage left him. The pillar holding up his house was gone. Two of his own captains, brothers named Rechab and Baanah, saw their opportunity. They went to Ishbosheth's house in the heat of the day, as he was taking his midday rest. They entered the house, found the king on his bed, and they struck him, bringing his life to an end. They took evidence of their deed and traveled all night, bringing their prize to David in Hebron, expecting a reward. But David's reaction was one of pure, righteous anger. "Wicked men have harmed a righteous person in his own house, on his own bed," he said to them. "Should I not now require his blood from your hand?" David commanded his young men, and they carried out the sentence on the two assassins. With both Ishbosheth and Abner gone, there was no one left to lead the house of Saul. The civil war was finally over. The elders of all the other tribes of Israel, the ones who had followed Ishbosheth, now journeyed to Hebron. They came before David and said, "We are your own flesh and blood. In times past, when Saul was king, you were the one who led us out and brought us in. And the Lord said to you, 'You shall shepherd my people Israel, and you shall be their ruler.'" So King David made a covenant with them in Hebron before the Lord, and for the third and final time the oil was brought out, and they anointed David king over all of Israel. He had reigned in Hebron over Judah for 7 years and 6 months, and now the entire nation was his. His first act as a unified king was a stroke of strategic genius. He needed a capital, a city that did not belong to Judah or to any of the northern tribes. He chose the fortress of Jerusalem, a city still held by the Jebusites, perched high on a mountain. The Jebusites, secure in their stronghold, taunted the new king. "You will not get in here," they shouted from the walls. "Even the blind and the lame can ward you off." But David led his men, not against the massive walls, but through a weakness they had overlooked. They entered the fortress through the water shaft, a hidden tunnel, and took the city from within. David captured the stronghold of Zion. He moved his house and his throne there, and he renamed it the City of David. The shepherd from Bethlehem, the fugitive from the caves, was finally and fully the king. With the kingdom united and the capital established in the City of David, the king turned his heart toward a greater purpose. Jerusalem was the political center, but David was determined to make it the spiritual heart of the nation. He sought to bring the Ark of the Covenant, the sacred symbol of God's presence, into his new city. He gathered 30,000 chosen men of Israel and went to retrieve the Ark. This was meant to be a day of pure celebration. They placed the Ark on a new cart, and with instruments of music, with harps and lyres and tambourines, they began the joyful procession toward Jerusalem. But their joy was based on a terrible mistake. They had not followed the ancient instructions. The Ark was not meant to be pulled by oxen on a cart. It was meant to be carried on poles by the priests. The procession continued until the oxen stumbled near a threshing floor. A man named Uzzah, who was walking beside the cart, reached out his hand to steady the sacred object. The moment he touched it, he fell, and his life expired there beside the Ark. A dreadful silence fell over the procession. The music stopped. The celebration turned to terror. David was shattered. He was afraid of the Lord that day, and he was angry. He realized he did not understand the holiness he was dealing with. He stopped the procession and would not bring the Ark to his city. He had it placed in the nearby house of a man named Obed-Edom. For 3 months, the Ark remained there, and David waited. He then received word that the Lord had blessed the house of Obed-Edom and all that he had. David's fear was replaced by a new understanding. He realized that the error was not with God, but with their own methods. He would try again, this time with proper reverence and preparation. The second attempt was a stark contrast to the first. The priests, the Levites, carried the Ark on their shoulders using the poles, just as the law prescribed. They made sacrifices with every few steps. This time, the procession was one of pure, unadulterated joy. There was shouting, and the sound of the trumpet echoed through the hills. David himself was overcome. He set aside his royal kingly robes. He wore a simple, humble linen ephod, the garment of a priest. And as the Ark entered his city, David, the king of all Israel, danced before the Lord with all his might. He was not performing for the crowd. He was not concerned with his own dignity. He was lost in a moment of pure, abandoned worship, a shepherd king celebrating before his God. But not everyone shared his joy. His wife Michal, the daughter of Saul, watched the procession from a window. She had been raised in a palace where royalty meant distance, formality, and control. When she saw her husband, the king, leaping and dancing among the common people, she did not feel joy. She felt contempt. She despised him in her heart for what she saw as a shameful, undignified display. When David returned to his house, she met him with a cold and biting sarcasm. "How glorious the king of Israel was today," she said, uncovering himself in the eyes of his servants' maids, as one of the common fellows shamelessly uncovers himself. But David's response was immediate, and it defined the deep difference between their two houses. "It was before the Lord," David said, his voice firm. "He chose me instead of your father and all his house to appoint me ruler over the people of the Lord, over Israel. Therefore I will play and celebrate before the Lord. And I will be even more undignified than this, and will be humble in my own sight." David was finally at peace. The kingdom was secure. His enemies were subdued. He was living in his new palace, a beautiful house of cedar wood. The nation was prospering, and the Ark of the Covenant was resting in its tent in Jerusalem. But this contrast began to trouble the king. One night, he sat with Nathan, the prophet, and his trusted advisor. "See now," David said, his voice quiet and thoughtful. "I dwell in a house of cedar, but the Ark of God dwells only inside tent curtains." The meaning was clear. David, the king, wanted to build a permanent, glorious temple for his God, a house worthy of the one who had given him everything. Nathan, hearing the king's pious desire, replied, "Go, do all that is in your heart, for the Lord is with you." But that very night, the word of the Lord came to Nathan. It was a message that would pivot the future of Israel. "Go and tell my servant David," the message began. "Thus says the Lord, would you build me a house to dwell in?" The voice was not angry, but it was corrective. "I have not dwelt in a house since the time I brought the children of Israel up from Egypt, even to this day, but have moved about in a tent. In all the places where I have moved with all the children of Israel, did I ever speak a word to anyone, saying, why have you not built me a house of cedar?" Then the message turned from a no to the greatest yes in history. The Lord told Nathan to remind David of his origins. "I took you from the sheepfold, from following the sheep, to be ruler over my people. I have been with you wherever you have gone, and have cut off all your enemies from before you." And then came the promise, a covenant that would echo through all eternity. "The Lord," Nathan was told to say, "declares to you that the Lord will make you a house. When your days are over and you rest with your fathers, I will set up your seed after you, who will come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever." David would not build God a house of stone. God would build David a house of flesh and blood, a dynasty that would never end. Nathan went to David and delivered the message. David, upon hearing it, did not react with disappointment or frustration. He was shattered with humility. He went and sat before the Lord, his heart overflowing. He had no words of protest, only words of awe. "Who am I, O Lord God?" David prayed, his voice barely a whisper. "And what is my family, that you have brought me this far? And as if this were not enough in your sight, you have also spoken of your servant's house for a great while to come. What more can David say to you? For you, O Lord God, know your servant. For your word's sake, and according to your own heart, you have done all these great things. You are great, O Lord God. There is none like you." The seasons turned. The snows of winter melted, and the land became green again. It was the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, when they lead their armies in the field to secure their borders and expand their rule. David's commander, Joab, and all the elite soldiers of Israel went forth to war against the Ammonites. They were strong, they were victorious, and they marched without their king. For David remained at Jerusalem. The warrior king, the man who had lived in caves and fields, the man who felt most alive in the heat of the conflict, stayed behind in the comfort of his palace. The idleness of the court which he had once fled now held him. One evening, after a long and restless afternoon, David arose from his bed and walked upon the roof of the king's house. From the height of his palace, he could see the whole city spread out before him in the twilight. He was the master of all he surveyed. And from that roof, he looked down and he saw a woman nearby. The woman was very beautiful to behold. The sight held him. It was a moment of fatal choice. He could have turned away. He could have honored the privacy of his subject. But he was the king, and he was idle. He did not turn away. Instead, he sent a servant to make an inquiry. The servant returned with the information. The words were clear, and they should have been a warning. "Is this not Bathsheba," the servant said, "the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" She was not an unknown woman. She was the daughter of one of his mighty men, and the wife of another. Uriah the Hittite was one of David's most loyal, most faithful, and most dedicated soldiers, a man who was, at that very moment, in the field, risking his life for his king and his nation. David heard the words. He knew exactly who she was, and it did not matter. He sent messengers, and he summoned her to the palace. He used the power of his kingship, the authority he had been given by God, to satisfy a fleeting personal desire. She was brought to the palace, a subject summoned by her king. And after the incident, he sent her back to her house. It was a cold, clinical, and silent abuse of his power. He was the king. He believed he could have whatever he wanted. He moved on, perhaps believing the incident was over, a secret buried in the privilege of his office. But some time passed, and then a message arrived for the king. It was from Bathsheba. The words were few, and they were terrifying, for they meant his private sin could not remain hidden. "I am with child." The message from Bathsheba shattered the king's peace. This was no longer a private transgression. It was a public and political crisis. The child would be born, and its timing would reveal the truth to all of Israel. David, the righteous king, the man after God's own heart, would be exposed. His mind, which had once been so sharp in battle and so humble in prayer, now turned to deception. The warrior's instinct for strategy was now bent toward a cover-up. The plan was simple. He had to bring the husband home. He sent a dispatch to his general, Joab, at the front lines. "Send me Uriah the Hittite," the order read. Joab, suspecting nothing, obeyed. Uriah, the loyal soldier, arrived in Jerusalem, covered in the dust of the campaign. He was brought before David. The king put on a display of feigned concern, asking questions he did not care about. "How is Joab doing?" David asked. "How are the soldiers? How is the war progressing?" Uriah gave his report, professional and precise. When he was finished, David put his plan into motion. "Go down to your house," the king said, with a tone of magnanimous generosity, "and wash your feet." It was an invitation to rest, to enjoy the comforts of home, to be with his wife. As Uriah left, David even sent a gift of food from the royal kitchen to his house, a further encouragement. The king waited. He was certain his plan would work. But the next morning, his servants brought him perplexing news. Uriah had not gone to his own house. Instead, he had taken his bedroll and slept at the entrance of the king's palace, with all the other servants and guards of his lord. David was frustrated. He summoned Uriah again. "Did you not come from a long journey?" David asked, feigning confusion. "Why then did you not go down to your own house?" Uriah's answer was a blade of integrity that should have pierced David's heart. He stood before his king, his loyalty absolute, and his words were a profound, unintended rebuke. "The ark and Israel and Judah are dwelling in tents," Uriah said, his voice firm, "and my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are encamped in the open field. Shall I then go to my house to eat and to drink and to be with my wife? As you live and as your soul lives, I will not do this thing." The simple, unbending honor of the soldier was a blinding contrast to the complex, shifting deceit of the king. David was stunned by this nobility. He had to try again. "Wait here today also," David commanded. "Tomorrow I will let you depart." That evening David invited Uriah to eat and drink with him at the royal table. He encouraged him to drink, and he made him drink heavily, hoping that the wine would break down the man's resolve and send him stumbling home to his wife. But even in his intoxication, Uriah's loyalty was stronger than David's sober corruption. When evening came, Uriah did not go to his house. He went again to his post, sleeping with the king's servants, his duty holding fast even when his mind was clouded. The king's plan had failed. The king's second plan had failed. Uriah's integrity was an immovable object, a silent judgment on the king's own failing. David was now desperate. The window of time was closing. His failed deceptions had only hardened his heart and pushed him further from the light. He saw only one path forward, a dark and permanent solution. The next morning David, the sweet psalmist of Israel, the man who wrote of truth and mercy, sat down and penned a letter. It was not a psalm, it was an order. It was a cold, calculated, and political document. He addressed it to his general, Joab, the commander of the army. When the letter was finished, he folded it and sealed it with the royal seal. He summoned Uriah the Hittite, the man of honor, and he gave the sealed letter to him. Uriah, loyal to the end, took the letter from his king, not knowing that he was holding the warrant for his own end. He took the dispatch and began the long journey back to the front lines, back to the war, carrying his own doom in his hands. He delivered the letter to Joab. Joab, a man of war, a man who was practical and ruthless, broke the seal and read the king's command. The words were clear. "Place Uriah in the very front, where the battle is most fierce. And then you shall pull back from him, so that he may be overcome." Joab understood the order. He was a servant of the king, and he did not question it. He continued the siege of the city. He observed where the city's defenders were strongest, and it was to that precise, desperate place that he assigned Uriah the Hittite. The battle horn sounded. Joab sent his men with Uriah at the front, charging toward the walls. The fighting was brutal. Then, at the critical moment, as the defenders pushed back with all their force, the Israelite soldiers who were with Uriah pulled back, just as their general had commanded. Uriah and the few men who remained with him were left exposed. They were overwhelmed. They fell in battle. The battle was over. Joab prepared his report. He sent a messenger back to Jerusalem to tell David all the things that had happened in the war. He instructed the messenger on exactly what to say. "When you have finished reporting all the events of the war to the king," Joab said, "tell him this also. Your servant Uriah the Hittite, his life is also ended." The messenger came to David and gave the report. The king listened, his face impassive. When the messenger delivered the final, fatal news, David gave a cold, calculated reply. "Thus you shall say to Joab," the king instructed, "do not let this thing displease you, for the sword devours one as well as another. I won't." He dismissed the messenger. The deed was done. The problem was solved. When the customary days of mourning for Uriah had passed, King David sent his messengers and brought Bathsheba to his house. She became his wife. The sin was complete. The cover-up was, he thought, successful. But the story does not end there. For the final ominous words of the chapter were written in heaven. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. A year passed. A year of silence. A year of ordinary court business. The seasons changed. The war with the Ammonites was won, and in the palace a child was born to David in Bathsheba. The king held his new son, and perhaps he believed the past was truly past. A dark chapter that had been successfully closed, sealed away by time and royal decree. The sin was buried. But the thing that David had done still displeased the Lord. The silence was broken by the arrival of Nathan the prophet. He was David's friend, his counselor, and his conscience. He came before the king, not with fire and brimstone, but with the quiet gravity of a man on a sacred mission. "I have a story for you, my lord," Nathan began. The king, settled in his restored peace, leaned in to listen. "There were 2 men in one city," Nathan said, his voice steady. "One was rich and one was poor. The rich man had exceedingly many flocks and herds. But the poor man had nothing, except for one little ewe lamb, which he had bought and nourished. It grew up together with him and with his children. It ate from his own meager portion and drank from his own cup and lay in his bosom. It was like a daughter to him." David listened intently, his own shepherd's heart moved by the image. "One day," Nathan continued, "a traveler came to the rich man. But the rich man was unwilling to take a lamb from his own flock to prepare for the visitor. Instead, he took the poor man's lamb, the only one he had, and he prepared it for the man who had come to him." As David heard this, his face darkened. His sense of justice, the very thing that made him a great king, exploded into a hot, righteous fury. He rose to his feet. "As the Lord lives," David declared, his voice shaking with anger, "the man who has done this thing deserves to be held accountable. He shall restore the lamb fourfold, because he did this thing and because he had no pity." The court was silent, waiting for the king to pass sentence. But Nathan did not move. He stood, his gaze locked on David. A terrible, heavy quiet filled the throne room. Then the prophet raised his hand and pointed, not at a distant enemy, but directly at the king. "You are the man." The words struck David with the force of a physical blow. All the air left his body, the anger vanished, replaced by a cold, sickening wave of recognition. Nathan's voice now held the full authority of his office. "Thus says the Lord God of Israel," the prophet declared, "I anointed you king over Israel. I delivered you from the hand of Saul. I gave you your master's house and your master's wives. I gave you the house of Israel and of Judah. And if that had been too little, I would have given you even more. Why have you despised the commandment of the Lord to do this evil in his sight? You have conspired against Uriah the Hittite. You have taken his wife to be your wife. You have used the sword of the children of Ammon to ensure his demise." The king stood, exposed and shattered, as the prophet delivered the judgment. "Now, therefore," Nathan pronounced, and every word was a stone laid on David's future, "conflict shall never depart from your house. Because you have despised me, and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife, I will raise up adversity against you from your own house. And the child who is born to you, that child shall surely not survive." The court, the crown, the victories, all of it faded. There was only David, a man broken before his God. He did not make excuses. He did not blame others. He did not argue. He fell, his body and his spirit, and he spoke the only truth that was left. "I have sinned against the Lord." The prophecy was not an idle threat. It was a dreadful promise, and it began to unfold with horrifying speed. The child, the son of David and Bathsheba, became ill. David, in an agony of repentance, pleaded for the child's life. He fasted, he wept, he lay on the ground all night, refusing all comfort, begging God for mercy, but the judgment was set. On the seventh day, the child passed away. David's sin had been paid for with a terrible price. But the prophecy had two parts. The child was the first. The second, and more enduring, was the sword. The sword shall never depart from your house. The blade did not come from a Philistine army or a foreign rival. It was forged within the walls of David's own palace, in the hearts of his own children. The king had a son named Amnon, his firstborn, and he had a daughter named Tamar, the full sister of his son Absalom. She was beautiful, and she was good. Amnon, the king's heir, began to look at his half-sister Tamar with a dark and consuming obsession. It was a sickness of the soul, an obsession that hollowed him out until he became ill, wasting away with this twisted fixation. His cunning cousin Jonadab saw his distress and offered a wicked solution. "Pretend to be sick," he advised. "And when your father the king comes to see you, ask him, 'Please, let my sister Tamar come and give me food, and prepare the food in my sight, that I may see it and eat it from her hand.'" Amnon did exactly as he was told. He lay in his bed and feigned illness. When King David came, the king was filled with concern for his firstborn. Amnon made his request, and David, suspecting nothing, saw it as a simple act of sibling care. "Go," he told Tamar, "go to your brother Amnon's house and prepare him food." Tamar, innocent and obedient, went. She was a sister coming to care for her brother. She arrived at his house, where he lay in his bed, and she began to make the food as he watched. When it was ready, she brought it to him, but he refused to eat. "Have all the men leave my presence," Amnon commanded his servants, and they all went out. Tamar was now alone with him in the chamber. "Bring the food into the bedroom," he said, "that I may eat from your hand." She did as he asked, but as she came near, his deception was revealed. He took hold of her. She was terrified. She pleaded with him, "No, my brother, do not do this. Such a thing should not be done in Israel. Do not do this disgraceful thing." She pleaded for his honor, for her own, for the law of their people, but he would not listen. He was stronger than she was, and he would not listen to her pleas, completing his terrible, selfish act. It was a violation of trust, a violation of family, and a violation of all that was right. And then, in a moment, his dark obsession vanished, and it was replaced by something even more monstrous, a profound and sudden hatred. The revulsion he felt for her now was greater than the desire he had felt before. He looked at her not as his sister, but as a symbol of his own shame. "Get up," he said, his voice cold. "Get out." She was shattered, her world destroyed. "No," she pleaded, "for this wrong in sending me away is greater than the other that you just committed." But he would not listen. He called his servant and commanded, "Put this person out of my sight and bolt the door after her." The servant did as he was told, casting her out and locking the door. Tamar was left in the hallway, her life in ruins. She wore a robe of many colors, the garment of a royal daughter. In her desolation, she took handfuls of ashes and put them on her head. She tore her beautiful robe. She laid her hand on her head and walked away, her cries echoing through the palace. She went to the house of her full brother Absalom. He saw her, and he understood immediately what had happened. His reaction was not hot like David's. It was cold. It was the chill of a blade being slowly drawn. "Has Amnon your brother been with you?" he asked, his voice low. "Be quiet for now, my sister. He is your brother. Do not take this thing to heart." Absalom took her into his own house, and she lived there, a shadow of her former self, desolate and shamed. When King David heard what had happened, he was very angry. His firstborn son had committed a terrible crime against his own daughter. But the king, whose own recent sin had cost him his moral authority, did nothing. His anger was a fire that gave no heat. He did not punish Amnon. He did not bring justice for Tamar. He was a father and a king, paralyzed. And in his silence, the sword in his house began to sharpen. 2 full years passed, 2 years of silence, 2 years of David's paralyzing inaction, 2 years of Tamar's desolation, and for 2 full years, Absalom, her brother, said nothing to Amnon, neither good nor bad. This silence was more terrifying than any rage. It was a cold, patient, simmering hatred that waited for its moment. Absalom, the handsome and charismatic prince, went about his life as if nothing was wrong, but he was watching and he was planning. The time came during the season of the sheep shearing, a time of feasting and celebration. Absalom prepared a great feast, and he invited all the king's sons. He went to his father, King David. "Your servant has a sheep shearing," he said, his voice full of respect. "Please, let the king and his servants come with me." David, perhaps uneasy, declined. "No, my son, let us not all go, lest we be a burden to you." Absalom pressed him. "If not," he said, "then please, let my brother Amnon go with us." The king hesitated. Why should he go with you? But Absalom urged him, and finally David relented. He did not see the trap that was set. He gave his blessing and sent Amnon and all his other sons to the feast with Absalom. The feast was loud and joyful. The wine flowed freely. Absalom, the perfect host, made sure that his brother Amnon's cup was never empty. He waited. He watched as Amnon drank, as his guard went down, as his heart became merry with wine. Absalom had already given his command to his servants in secret. "Mark my words," he had told them. "When Amnon's heart is cheerful with wine, and when I say to you, 'Strike Amnon,' then you shall know what to do. Do not be afraid. Have I not commanded you? Be courageous." Now, in the midst of the feast, Absalom looked at his men. His eyes were cold. He gave the signal. Absalom's servants moved as one. They surrounded the prince, the king's firstborn. Before anyone could react, before the other brothers could even stand, the deed was done. Amnon, the heir to the throne, was on the ground, and his life had ended. The debt for Tamar had been paid. Panic erupted. The other sons of the king, horrified, scrambled for their mules. They fled in terror, believing they would be next. They rode for Jerusalem as fast as they could, a wave of terror carrying them back to their father. Absalom did not flee with them. His act was not one of passion, but of cold, calculated judgment. He had done what his father, the king, would not. And now he too was a fugitive. He rode hard and fast, not to Jerusalem, but into exile, finding refuge in a distant land. Back in the palace, a rumor arrived before the princes. A messenger ran to David, his face white. "Absalom has attended to all the king's sons. Not one of them is left." David tore his robes, his mind going to the darkest possible place. But then, his other sons arrived, covered in dust, weeping but alive. They told him the true, terrible story. It was not all the sons. It was only one. It was Amnon. The sword had struck again, this time wielded by a brother's hand. The house of David was broken, and the king was left to weep for the son who had been lost, and for the son who had been the cause. Absalom had returned to Jerusalem. For 2 full years he was allowed to live in his own house, a prince in the city, but he was banished from the king's presence. This separation, this cold silence from his father, did not break Absalom's spirit, it hardened it. It watered the seeds of resentment that had been planted long ago. Finally, David relented and called for his son. But the reconciliation, when it came, was a hollow and formal thing. Absalom had not returned to be a son. He had returned to be a rival. He was, by all accounts, a man of remarkable appearance, praised in all of Israel for his beauty. He had a magnificent head of hair, so heavy that it became a thing of legend. But his true political tool was not his appearance, it was his charisma. He began to rise early in the morning and go to the city gate, the place where all the people of the kingdom came to seek justice from the king. As a citizen would approach, Absalom would intercept them. "What town are you from?" he would ask, his voice full of warmth and concern. When the person explained their grievance, Absalom would listen intently, his face a mask of sympathy. Then he would plant the seed of dissent. "See," Absalom would say, shaking his head sadly, "your claims are good and right, but there is no one deputized by the king to hear you." He would lean in, as if sharing a secret. "Oh, that I were made judge in the land, then every man who had any suit or cause could come to me, and I would give him justice." He presented himself not as a prince, but as a man of the people, frustrated by the very system he was a part of. When any man came near to pay him homage, he would not allow it. He would reach out his hand, take hold of him, and greet him with the familiarity of a brother. In this way, with this careful political theater, Absalom moved through the crowds. He was the king's son, offering a solution to the king's perceived failures. He was handsome, he was present, and he was sympathetic. And so, day by day, citizen by citizen, he stole the hearts of the men of Israel. This continued for 4 long years. The conspiracy grew in silence. When he knew the time was right, he went to his father, King David, with a face of perfect piety. "Please," Absalom said, "let me go to Hebron and pay a vow which I have vowed to the Lord. For your servant made a vow while I was in exile, saying, 'If the Lord will indeed bring me back to Jerusalem, then I will serve the Lord.'" David, still blind to the ambition in his son's heart, saw only a sign of repentance. "Go in peace," the king said. Absalom went to Hebron, the old capital, the very place where David himself had first been anointed king. But he did not go to pray. He went to rule. He sent spies throughout all the tribes of Israel with a secret, coordinated message. As soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, the message said, "Then you shall say, 'Absalom reigns in Hebron.'" The conspiracy was deep and wide. He had gathered 200 men from Jerusalem, who went with him in their innocence, knowing nothing of his plan. And he had sent for Ahithophel, King David's own counselor, a man whose wisdom was said to be like the oracle of God. The trumpet sounded, the rebellion was declared, and the hearts of the people, which had been so carefully stolen, went with Absalom. The news reached the palace in Jerusalem like a thunderclap. A messenger arrived, his face pale, his words confirming the impossible. "The hearts of the men of Israel are with Absalom." The depth of the betrayal was staggering. It was not a border skirmish or a foreign threat. This was a coup, led by his own son and supported by his most trusted advisor. David's paralysis, which had begun with Tamar's pain and Amnon's end, was now broken by pure, cold fear. He knew the brilliance of Ahithophel. He knew the charisma of Absalom. He knew he could not hold the city. "Arise," David said to his servants, his voice heavy. "We must flee. We must leave the city at once, or he will not hesitate to strike us down and the city with us." This was not a king's strategic retreat. It was a father's walk of shame. David and his household and his most loyal guards walked out of the city gates. As they passed the last house, they paused. David looked at his followers, and his eyes fell on Ittai the Gittite, a foreigner who had only recently joined his service. "Why are you also coming with us?" David asked him. "Go back. Stay with the new king. You are a foreigner and an exile. You just arrived. Why should I make you wander with me, seeing I go where I may? Go back and take your brothers with you. May mercy and truth be with you." But Ittai looked at his king, the man who was now a fugitive, and his loyalty was absolute. "As the Lord lives," Ittai declared, "and as my lord the king lives, surely in what place my lord the king shall be, whether for passing from this life or for living, there also will your servant be." The sad procession continued. The priests, Zadok and Abiathar, came, and they were carrying the Ark of the Covenant, the very symbol of God's presence. They were prepared to take it into the wilderness with their king. But David stopped them. "Carry the Ark of God back into the city," he commanded. This was his most profound act of faith. "If I shall find favor in the eyes of the Lord, he will bring me back again and show me both it and his dwelling place. But if he says this, 'I have no delight in you,' then here I am. Let him do to me what seems good to him." David was no longer fighting his judgment. He was accepting it. He and his followers began the long, hard climb up the Mount of Olives. David walked barefoot, a sign of a true mourner. He had covered his head, his face hidden, and he wept as he went. And all the people who were with him covered their heads, and they too wept as they walked. As they reached the top, another figure appeared. It was Shimei, a man from the house of Saul. He saw David, the fallen king, and all the bitterness and hatred from his own lost house poured out of him. He ran along the ridge, parallel to the king, and he threw stones in David's direction. He kicked up dust, and he cursed him. Come out, you guilty man, you scoundrel," Shimei screamed. "The Lord has brought upon you all the blood of the house of Saul, in whose place you have reigned. The Lord has delivered the kingdom into the hand of Absalom your son. See, you are taken in your own mischief, because you are a guilty man." Abishai, Joab's brother, was furious. He turned to David. "Why should this man curse my lord the king? Please, let me go over and silence him." But David, in his profound, painful submission, stopped him. "What have I to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah?" David said, his voice weary. "Let him curse. Because the Lord has said to him, 'Curse David,' who then shall say, 'Why have you done so?'" He looked at his loyal men, his heart broken. "Behold, my own son, who came from my own body, seeks my life. How much more now may this Benjamite? Let him alone, let him curse, for the Lord has bidden him. It may be that the Lord will look on my affliction, and that the Lord will repay me with good for his cursing this day." And so the king walked on barefoot and weeping, covered in dust and curses, accepting his humiliation as the just payment for his long-buried sin. David and his loyal followers had crossed the Jordan and established a foothold in the city of Mahanaim. The people there, loyal to the true king, brought them beds and basins and food. The weary, grieving king was now a general once more, and he organized his faithful army. He divided them into 3 companies, under the command of his 3 most trusted generals, Joab, Abishai, and Ittai the Gittite. The armies of Absalom, led by his new general Amasa, had also crossed the Jordan. The final, terrible confrontation was now inevitable. As his men marched out, David stood by the gate, his heart not on the battle but on one person. He gave his commanders a direct, public, and desperate order. "Deal gently, for my sake," he pleaded, his voice full of anguish, with the young man, with Absalom. All the soldiers, all the captains, and all the generals heard the king's command. It was not a suggestion. It was the one condition of the battle. The 2 armies met in the thick, tangled wilderness of the wood of Ephraim. It was a place of shadows, gnarled roots, and hidden pits. The battle was not a clean fight of shield walls and formations. It was a confused, brutal, and chaotic clash. The woods themselves became a weapon. The forest was a trap, and more men were lost to the thickets and the swamps of the woods than were lost to the edge of the blade. The army of Absalom was routed, their rebellion falling apart in the disorienting trees. Absalom, in his panic, was riding his mule, trying to escape. He rode hard under the thick branches of a great oak tree. His head, with its famous heavy hair that had been his vanity and his political tool, became caught in the low, strong boughs. The mule, sensing its rider was gone, ran on, and Absalom was left, hanging there. He was held fast, caught between heaven and earth, his pride and his rebellion undone by the branches of a tree. He was helpless. A soldier, one of David's men, saw him there. He did not touch him. He remembered the king's words. He ran and found Joab. "Behold," the soldier said, "I saw Absalom, held in an oak." Joab's face hardened. He was a pragmatist, a man of cold, hard duty. "You saw him," Joab said, "and you did not attend to him there? I would have given you 10 shekels of silver and a belt." The soldier stood his ground. "Though I should receive 1,000 shekels of silver in my hand," he replied, "I would not put my hand on the king's son. For in our hearing the king commanded you, and Abishai and Ittai, saying, 'Beware that none touch the young man Absalom.'" Joab had no patience for this. "I cannot waste time like this with you." He turned and strode away. He knew that as long as Absalom lived, the kingdom would never be at peace. The king's heart was in the way of the king's throne. Joab, defying the king's explicit, emotional command, decided to end the civil war himself. He took 3 weapons in his hand and went to the oak. He found the prince, still living, held in the heart of the tree. Joab approached him. He did not hesitate. He raised his hand and struck. After Joab had acted, his 10 young armor-bearers surrounded the prince to ensure the deed was done. The rebellion was over. Absalom's life was over. They sounded a trumpet, and the battle ceased. They took the prince's body, placed it into a great pit in the woods, and laid a very great heap of stones upon it. The war was done. David waited at the city gate, his entire being coiled in a knot of dread. The battle raged in the woods, but his heart was not with the strategy. It was with one person. A watchman on the wall called out that he saw a man running alone. The king's heart leaped. "If he is alone," David said, "there is good news in his mouth." The runner was Ahimaaz, the son of the priest, a fast and loyal man. He arrived breathless and fell before the king. "All is well," he panted. "The Lord your God has delivered up the men who lifted their hand against my lord the king." David heard none of it. He pushed past the report, his voice tight with a single desperate question. "Is the young man Absalom safe?" Ahimaaz hesitated. He had seen the truth, but he could not bring himself to be the one to deliver the blow. "I saw a great tumult when Joab sent me," he deflected, "but I did not know what it was." "Turn aside," the king said, his dread returning. Just then a second runner arrived, a man from Cush. He too declared the victory. "My lord the king, today the Lord has avenged you." Again David asked the only question that mattered. "Is the young man Absalom safe?" This time there was no escaping it. The man looked at the king with pity, and he spoke the truth in a careful, respectful way. "May the enemies of my lord the king, and all who rise against you to do you harm, be like that young man." It was done. The words, so gentle, struck David like a spear. He did not cry out. He did not get angry. He simply broke. The king, the warrior, the man who had faced giants, was undone. His face crumpled. He turned from the gate, his soldiers watching in silence. He began the long walk up to the small chamber, the room over the city gate. And as he went, the people in the street below could hear him. His control was gone, replaced by a raw, profound, and devastating grief. He wept, and he spoke to the empty air. "Oh, my son Absalom," he cried, his voice breaking. My son, Absalom, if only I had been the one to pass from this life, instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." The victory of that day was turned into mourning for all the people. The soldiers, who had just won a kingdom for their king, did not celebrate. They heard his cries. They stole back into the city quietly, as if they were ashamed, like an army that had fled in defeat. The victory was meaningless. The kingdom was ashes. The king was hidden in his room, covering his face, weeping for his lost son. It was Joab, the cold, practical general, who finally broke the spell. He went to the king, his patience gone. "You have shamed all your servants today," he said, his voice hard. "They saved your life, and the lives of your sons and daughters. But you love your enemies and you hate your friends. You have made it clear that your princes and servants are nothing to you. If Absalom had lived and all of us had perished, it would have pleased you. Now arise, go out and speak to the heart of your servants, for I swear by the Lord, if you do not go out, not one man will remain with you tonight." David, his face streaked with tears and his heart hollow, heard the brutal truth. He was still a king. He rose from his grief, washed his face, and went down to sit at the gate. The king had returned. The kingdom was restored, but it was a kingdom of scars. David, having returned to Jerusalem, was no longer the barefoot fugitive accepting his judgment. He was a powerful king, secure on his throne, and in this time of peace and strength, a restless pride began to stir. He began to look at the might of his own hand, at the armies he commanded, rather than the God who had given them to him. This quiet pride culminated in a single, fateful order. He turned to his general, Joab. "Go," he commanded. "Go now through all the tribes of Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, and count the people, that I may know the number of the people." Joab was appalled. He, a man who had never shied from a difficult task, saw this for what it was, a sin of arrogance. "Why does my lord the king require this thing?" Joab pleaded. "May the Lord add to the people 100 times over, but why does my lord delight in this?" But the king's word was final. Joab obeyed, but he did so with a heavy heart. He and his commanders spent months crossing the land, counting the fighting men. When they returned, the number was vast. The strength of Israel was confirmed on paper, and it was only then, after the deed was done, that David's heart struck him. The pride vanished, replaced by the sickening realization of his sin. "I have sinned greatly in what I have done," he prayed. That night, the prophet Gad, David's seer, came to him with a message. The Lord was offering a choice, a consequence for his pride. "Thus says the Lord," Gad spoke, "I offer you 3 things. Choose one of them. Shall 3 years of famine come to your land? Or will you flee for 3 months before your enemies? Or shall there be 3 days of a great affliction in your land?" David was trapped. It was an impossible choice. But his answer showed the one piece of wisdom that had never left him. "I am in great distress," David said. "Please, let us fall into the hand of the Lord, for his mercies are great. But do not let me fall into the hand of man." So the Lord sent a great affliction upon Israel. The loss was swift and terrible. By the time it was over, 70,000 men had been lost. Then David looked up, and he was given a vision. He saw the angel of the Lord standing by the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. The angel's hand was outstretched over Jerusalem, a drawn sword in his hand, ready to continue the judgment. David, in his finest moment of repentance, fell on his face. "I am the one who has sinned," he cried out. "I am the one who has done wrong. But these, the sheep, what have they done? Let your judgment, I beg you, be against me and against my father's house." The Lord heard his plea. The prophet Gad came to him again. "Go up and rear an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Araunah." David went at once. Araunah saw the king coming and offered him the land, the oxen, the wood, everything for free. But David refused. "No," the king declared, his voice firm. "I will surely buy it from you at a price. I will not offer to the Lord my God that which costs me nothing." He purchased the threshing floor, he built the altar, he offered the sacrifices. And as the smoke rose, the Lord answered. The great affliction was stopped, and the place where the king's repentance met God's mercy, that very spot, would one day become the site of the great temple. King David was now very old, and the fire that had defined him had burned low. He was frail, and his servants covered him with clothes, but he could not get warm. As his strength faded, the old familiar rivalries of his court began to circle. The sword that was never to depart his house had one last edge. His son, Adonijah, a man as handsome and charismatic as Absalom had been, saw the power vacuum. He decided the throne should be his. He gathered chariots and horsemen, and he secured the loyalty of the powerful Joab, the general, and Abiathar, the priest, who had been with David from the beginning. Adonijah held a great feast, a coronation, and he declared, "I will be king." But in his arrogance he did not invite the prophet Nathan, nor the priest Zadok, nor the loyal commander Benaiah, nor his younger brother Solomon. Nathan the prophet, who had once confronted the king about his sin, now moved to save his kingdom. He went to Bathsheba, Solomon's mother. "Have you not heard?" he said. "Adonijah reigns, and our Lord David does not know it. Go in at once to the king. Remind him of the oath he swore to you, that your son Solomon would reign after him." Bathsheba did as he said. She went to the aged king. "My lord," she said, "you swore to your maidservant that my son Solomon would reign, but now Adonijah reigns, and Joab and the priest Abiathar are with him." As she was speaking, Nathan the prophet entered. "My lord, O king," he said, "have you declared that Adonijah shall reign? For he has gone this day and held a great feast, and they are eating and drinking, and they are crying, 'Long live King Adonijah.'" David's mind, which had been clouded by age, became sharp. With his last remaining strength, he acted with the old, decisive authority. "Call Zadok the priest, and Nathan the prophet, and Benaiah," he commanded. "Take the servants of your Lord, and have Solomon my son ride on my own mule. Take him down to the Gihon spring. Let Zadok and Nathan anoint him there as king over Israel. Then blow the trumpet, and say, 'Long live King Solomon.'" The order was followed. A great procession went down to the spring. Solomon was anointed. The trumpet sounded, and the people began to rejoice, their shouts so loud that the earth split with the sound. Back at Adonijah's feast, the sound of the trumpet and the shouting reached them. Joab, the old general, heard it, and his blood ran cold. Why is the city in such an uproar? Just then Jonathan, the priest's son, arrived. "All is well," he said, but the news was for Adonijah. "Truly, our Lord King David has made Solomon king." The conspiracy dissolved in terror. All the guests who were with Adonijah were afraid, and they rose, and every man went his own way. With Solomon now secure, David knew his time was short. He called his son to his bedside for one final charge. First, he commanded him to be strong, to walk in the ways of the Lord, to keep his commandments, so that he might prosper. Then the king, who had so often chosen mercy, turned to justice. "You know," he said, his voice a low rasp, "what Joab the son of Zeruiah did to me. He put the mark of war on his belt in a time of peace. He is responsible for the passing of two commanders, Abner and Amasa. He must be held accountable. Act according to your wisdom. And then, David continued, there is Shimei, the one who cursed me with a grievous curse on the day I fled. I swore an oath to him that I would not use the sword against him. But you are a wise man. You are not bound by that oath. You are a wise man. You will know what you ought to do to him and hold him accountable for that day. It was a final, grim settling of accounts. A king passing on both his blessings and his burdens. David's final words were spoken. The charges were given. The kingdom was secure. Then the man who had been a shepherd, a musician, a giant slayer, a fugitive, a sinner, and a king, rested with his ancestors. He was buried in his own city, the city of David. He had reigned over Israel for 40 years, 7 years in Hebron, and 33 years in Jerusalem. His legacy was written in the stones of the city he had built and in the hearts of the people he had united. But his true, undying legacy was written in his songs. He was the sweet psalmist of Israel, the man who had given voice to every human emotion. He had penned psalms of pure, exultant joy. He had cried out in psalms of bitter, bone-deep despair and fear. And he had written psalms of profound, broken repentance. His story was a tapestry of contradictions. He was a man of soaring faith and a man of catastrophic failure. He was a man of profound mercy, who twice spared the life of his enemy, and a man of cold calculation, who orchestrated the end of his loyal soldier. This leads to the great central question of his life. Why? Why was this flawed, broken, and complex man of all men the one chosen to be called a man after God's own heart? The answer is not found in his perfection, for he had none. It is not found in his military victories or his political genius. The answer is found in his repentance. David's heart, unlike Saul's, was soft. When confronted with his sin, he did not make excuses. He did not shift blame. He did not harden his heart. He broke. When Nathan the prophet pointed his finger and said, "You are the man," David's heart shattered, and his response was, "I have sinned." When the plague came for his pride, he fell on his face and said, "I am the one." His heart, when it was broken, always, in every instance, broke in the direction of God. That was his true greatness. Not that he never fell, but that every time he fell, he turned back. His life was not a testament to human goodness, but a staggering display of divine grace. He was a shepherd who became a king, and a king who, in his final and greatest act, showed the world that the only way back to God is through a broken and a contrite heart. And his greatest legacy was the one he did not live to see, the eternal promise of an heir, the son of David, who was still yet to come. As we reach the end of this journey, from the shepherd fields of Bethlehem to the throne of Jerusalem, we are left with the story of a life that is both inspiring and deeply human. To me, the story of David is not a simple tale of a hero. It is a profound, and at times difficult, look into the complexity of a human heart. When I think of David, I feel a range of emotions. I feel admiration for the young man whose faith was so pure that he could face a giant with nothing but a sling and a stone. I feel moved by the depth of his love for his friend Jonathan and the genuine grief in his lament. But there are other parts of his story that are harder to read. When we follow him onto the palace roof in chapter 18, we see a good man make a terrible choice. His actions that followed, the calculated letter he sent with the loyal Uriah, are a heartbreaking part of the story. It is a dark and painful reminder that even the best among us, when led by idleness and power, are capable of profound failings. Perhaps the most important lesson in this entire narrative comes from its consequences. The story is honest. It does not hide the fact that David's choices brought a sword into his own house. The tragedies of Tamar, Amnon, and Absalom are the direct, devastating results of his failure as a father and a king, a failure born from his own choices. Forgiveness, we learn, does not erase consequences. But this is not, in the end, a story about failure. It is a story about repentance. The single most defining moment, the reason David is remembered as a man after God's own heart, is not his victory over Goliath. It is his response in chapter 21. When Nathan the prophet confronted him with the truth, David did not make excuses. He did not blame Bathsheba. He did not, like Saul, harden his heart in pride. He simply broke. He said, "I have sinned." This story teaches us that our lives are not defined by our perfection. They are defined by what we do after we fall. We will all have our own struggles. We will all, in ways big or small, make choices we regret. The great question this story leaves us with is not if we will fail, but how we will respond. Will we hide our choices, make excuses, and let our hearts grow hard? Or will we, like David, find the courage to face our own truth, to break, and to turn back? The Shepherd King's greatest legacy is this: it is never too late to repent, and no heart is too broken to be restored. If this story touched your heart, please give this video a like. It helps the light reach others who may need it. Share your thoughts and reflections in the comments below. I would love to hear what part spoke to you most. And if you wish to continue this journey of quiet stories, faith, and healing, subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next chapter. May the light stay with you, always.